Hey everybody, this is Dawn with Painted Willow Art. I posted something on my Instagram stories a couple of days ago to see if anybody would be interested in learning how to do watercolor bubbles like these. This is a piece that's in progress. The mermaid obviously isn't finished yet, but the bubbles I quite like and thought I would show you how to do that. And quite a few people said yes, they want to learn how. So we're going to learn how to do these bubbles today. I'm going to work on a smaller piece of paper for the examples. I have two different brushes. I have a number 12 and a number 8 watercolor brush. And I have my Josie Lewis watercolor paint set. And I have a white pen. And I have a black Sharpie somewhere that I can't find that I'll get in just a minute. I am also going to show you an option with some metallic paint. So for the metallic paint, I'm going to use this blue color. It's called Aloha Kai, and the paint is by Artistic Isle Watercolors. So I am going to use a little bit of that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So first off, I'm going to zoom you in a little bit. This is probably going to be sideways because I don't have a tripod that will sit above me so you can look down from the same vantage point I have. But the bubbles don't really have, they're not directional, so it doesn't really make any difference. I do not have my paper taped down to anything today. And this is just regular 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. And what I'm going to do first is give us a little bit of a background so that we look like we're underwater. So I'm just going to take and paint on plain water over this whole piece of paper. You don't have to be real exact about it. And in a couple of my other videos, I've shown you this. You can kind of see the sheen on the paper. We're not going for sopping wet, just that little bit of a shiny sheen on the paper. And if you miss some spots, you know, some spots are still dry, that's okay, because we're not going for a solid background anyway. So I'm going to use, out of this watercolor set, I'm going to use the lightest blue to start with. And I'm just picking that blue up right out of the pan on the brush. Yes, it splopped there, but I'm not worried about that. And I'm just going to splop some paint here and there and kind of wipe it around. We're going for the look of, you know, kind of watery here and there in the background. So I'm just splopping some paint around. I am going to go back in and pick up a little bit of a darker blue. And I'm going to do kind of the same thing. I'm just going to drop some bits of it here and there. And you'll notice I don't have this paper taped down, so it's curling up in the middle. I'm not really worried about it being too exact, so I'm just going to stick my finger on it, my fingernail on it to hold it down. And I'm just doing the same thing I did with the light blue. I'm just giving myself little bits of darker blue here and there so that when this dries, it's just going to kind of give me a bit of a mottled background. Okay, so I'm going to speed this up for a second and dry this, and then I will show you how to do the bubbles. So hold on for a second. Okay, so my paper settled back down a little bit. You can see it is still a little bit curled, but that's okay. I'm not going to worry about that for today. I can always flatten it later. You may have noticed while I was drying it that I would hold my finger here and there to kind of hold it down so that things dried a little more evenly instead of all the paint going to one side. Certainly you can do that. I would just caution you, if you're going to do that, make sure that where you're touching to hold it down is dry, because if not, you're going to end up with a fingerprint in your watercolor. So if you do want to dry it like that and hold it here and there, just make sure the spots you're putting your finger are dry. You may have noticed that mine is actually a heat gun. If you want to dry sections of your painting at home, I do recommend using a blow dryer as opposed to a heat gun. Heat can sometimes change the way the color looks. And if you use a blow dryer just on the cool setting, that's not going to monkey with the colors at all. I do have my heat gun on the lowest setting, and I wasn't using it terribly long, so you know, for today that's fine. But if you're going to do this at home, I would recommend a blow dryer as opposed to a heat gun. But the idea is we want to have this background dry, and you can see that it does now kind of look all watery, kind of like on the sample. Oops, I've got you zoomed in so you can't see, don't I? So we've got kind of that watery background look going. So now what we need to do is put some bubbles on here, because if we have things like mermaids and turtles and other things that breathe air under the water, they're going to make bubbles. And this is just, it's such a fun way to make bubbles because it's not real exact. And you get to decide where they're going to go. So I'm wetting my brush, and then from my paint, I'm going to use the lightest blue that I have. That's going to be the background of my bubbles. And I'm going to come over here and just paint a circle with it. And I'm going to put a little bit more water in there because I want it nice and wet. You decide how big that circle's going to be. And then I kind of pull the paint out towards the edges a bit. Now I got a little heavy-handed on this one, so I'm going to rinse my brush off, and I'm going to come back with a clean, dried off brush, and I'm just going to wipe some of that paint out there. So I'm going to clean my brush again, wipe it off, and I'm wiping it on my shirt sleeve, which you can't see off camera. And I'm just going to wipe some of that blue paint off, so I don't have quite as much there. And the idea here is that I'm just stroking all of this towards the outside edge so that I've got a lighter spot in the middle, and I'm going to have darker around the edges. So in this paint palette that I'm using, the lightest blue that I have is what I used for the base. I've got a couple of darker blues over here, and I will use all of them for this, just so that my bubbles have a slightly different look from each other. They're not all uniform. So I'm going to go over to one of my darker blues over here, and you don't have to pick up a lot of brush on the paint. I just swiped it over that a couple of times, and I'm going to use the chisel tip on this brush. And I'm just going to lightly draw around the edges with that darker blue on there. If it feels like you're running out of paint, grab a little bit more if you need to, but this is easier to do with a little bit at a time and go back and pick up more paint if you need to, rather than loading your brush up real heavy to begin with, because this is a lot harder to take off just because of the technique that we're using. So essentially, that's my bubble. It doesn't look like much right now. If you want to, you can kind of move your paper around a little bit so that those colors mix. Just try to keep that lighter spot in the middle. Okay, so that's essentially the base of the bubble. I'm going to do a couple more and then I'll dry them all at the same time, because what I want you to see is the difference when they dry. It doesn't look like the example that I showed you right now, but these colors blend a little bit more, and the darker stays at the edge when it dries, and that's where you get a little more crisp outline on the bubble. So I'm going to leave that one for just a second. I'm going to do just a couple more. You can do these whatever size you want to do them. So I'm going to do a couple smaller ones here. Whatever size you like. And if they're not exactly circular, that's okay. Bubbles, nothing in nature is exactly circular or exactly square or exactly triangular. So I got a little bit more paint than I wanted, so I'm just going back with a clean dry brush, wiping off a little bit of the center so I have that lighter spot in the center again. And I'm going to use a little bit of purple this time, I think, for this one. So I picked up just a little bit of purple on the brush, and I'm going right around the outside edge, very lightly with the chisel tip of that brush. If you feel like you need a little bit more paint, go back and pick up just a little bit more. And when I say pick up paint, I'm just lightly wiping it across the pan and the palette. I'm not, really scrubbing and getting in there to get a lot of paint. And I'm going to use a different blue on this one. That blue's not quite as dark as the other two, but that's okay. That's what gives us different looks on these bubbles. And I think I'm going to do purple again on this little guy. So there we go. And like I said, if you want to move your paper around a little bit, those are wet, so as you're moving that paper around, the paint's kind of flowing and moving into each other. I am going to do one more that's a different color because I want to show you that you can do this in something other than blue. So I'm going to do a big one in pink as well. And when would you ever see a pink bubble? You see a pink bubble in the ocean? Probably not. But in the whimsical world of things I paint, of course there could be a pink bubble. You could have whatever color bubble you want. So I'm going back with the darker blue again. Ooh, that's dark. And I'm going to go just right around the edge. Now, when I mentioned a minute ago that if you get too much paint, it's harder to take this off when you're doing the edge, that's exactly what I mean. I got too much paint on this brush, but I'm not gonna worry about it because I don't really care that these are terribly exact. So I'm just gonna roll that paper around a little bit. I won't have quite as much pink, it'll be more purple, but that's okay. So I'm gonna speed this up and dry it for a second, and then I will show you what they look like when they're dry. All right, I moved my camera around a little bit, so now you're going to be upside down to where I'm drawing, but again, the bubbles don't really have directionality, so it doesn't matter much. I just realized the light was shining on this when it was wet, making it hard for you to see what was going on. So I've dried these, and you can see the effect that we ended up with. We've got the lighter spot in the middle and then darker around the edges, and depending on how much paint you got, they all have kind of differing degrees of the light to dark gradient. This one, I don't know if you watched closely while I was drying it, I came back in with my brush and wiped part of that off because the purple was just overtaking the pink. So I cleaned off my brush, dried it. While that was still wet, I wiped the brush across it to take some of it off, and then I came back with a clean, slightly damp brush and just pulled some of that paint back towards the middle. So ultimately I do have the idea of lighter in the middle, darker around the edges, okay? Because the light was so bad on those others, I'm going to do a couple more just so you can see them, because I think it might have been kind of hard to see when they were wet what it was I was doing. So let's do just one or two more. So again, I'm starting with my light blue, and I'm just painting a big circle. And then I'm going to kind of pull all that paint out towards the edges, leaving the center a little bit lighter. And while that's still wet, I'm going to go into a darker blue. And with just the chisel tip of that brush, I'm going to run it right around the edge. And hopefully the light is right this time. You can see that kind of where I stop and pick up my brush, it makes a little blob. So instead of a smooth edge, it kind of looks like little blobs all the way around. Those a lot of times will flatten out. It'll disperse into the paint while you dry it, but if you don't like it, you can just go back around it again and pull those little blobs out. Just making sure to keep that darkest paint right at the edge, okay? And then again, if you want to, you can tip your paper a little bit back and forth. You can see how that kind of bleeds into each other. When it dries, and all of that lightens, it bleeds real nicely. So I'm gonna do one more pink one, just because I kind of messed up the first one with too much purple. And I'm having to hold this paper down because I didn't tape it to anything. The way it's buckling, it's making the paint run to one side of the bubble, and I don't want that, so I'm just holding it down with my fingers. And I'm going to use purple on this one again, but I'm not going to put quite as much on it this time. So just like the blue one, I'm just dragging it right around the edges. If you feel like you want a little more paint, grab a little bit more, but do a little bit at a time. Much easier to put more on than it is to take off, as you saw with the other pink bubble. And again, to get kind of that blotchy look out, I'm just going right back over the purple that I just put on and just kind of scrubbing back and forth lightly. I'm using hardly any pressure at all. I'm just mainly using that little chisel tip on the brush. And put just a little more purple here and there. And again, with this one, if you want to, if you just real easy, pick your paper up and move it side to side, those will kind of blend together a little bit. So let me put this back on fast speed and we'll dry those two. All right, those two are much better, aren't they? So there's the two I just did. Those are the ones I did before. This one we're considering kind of an experiment because I got too much paint on that one and yeah. So the lesson there is less paint. Go back and pick up a little bit at a time if you need to, but start with less paint. So I'm much happier with that one than that one. But you can see these still have the lighter in the middle, the darker around the edges. And what I love about this technique is that where you've put that paint around the edges, it naturally, because it's wet when you do it, it naturally bleeds into the lighter paint, but you also get this nice dark rim around the edge, so it really kind of defines the bubble. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. So my bubbles are essentially done. What we need to do now is embellish them a little bit. So what I like to do with them is go in with a Sharpie or a Micron Pigma pen, whatever black pen you've got, and I give them a little bit of an outline. I do it with an extra fine tip so that it's not a huge black outline because I've already got a little bit of dark around there, so I don't want to take away from that. So I just go in and give them a really light outline. And then the other thing I do to give it a little bit more interest is I put some smaller bubbles that don't have any color in them. So I'll go in and draw just a few bubble outlines here and there. Just because I think that accents them quite nicely. Gives it a little bit of character. And if you've ever gone underwater and blown bubbles out, you know, you get them all sizes, all shapes, depending on where the sun's shining, they can be all different colors. You kind of get the rainbow prism effect through the water that can make them look like they're different colors. So there we go. Now the last thing I do is take my white pen. This is my favorite white pen at the moment. It's a Uniball Signo gel pen. And I will come back in and give just a little bit of a highlight on one side of the bubble. I don't do this on just the little outlines. I only do it on the big color bubbles. You can see that really stands out on the color. So there you go, bubbles. I love it because it's a really easy technique. Now, sometimes if I really want to set them off, I will go in and put a little bit of a shimmer on them. So for the blue ones, I'm going to use this blue color. It's called Aloha Kai from Artistic Isle, and it's a metallic. And I will just lightly go over that. It's kind of a light paint anyway, and I don't have a ton of it on the brush. And I'll just go right over the top. And you probably can't see a whole lot of what it's doing on camera right now, but I will show you in a minute when it dries. It just leaves a little bit of a shimmer right over the top. And it can also act to tone down some of the colors underneath. Like that one had a couple of spots of really vibrant purple, so does this one. So going over the top, it can kind of tone those down a little bit if you don't like the way that turned out. And I'm going to do the same thing with the pink and purple ones, only I'm going to use this color. It's called Wolfsbane. Again, it's from Artistic Isle. And I'm not using a ton of it. I'm just using it to be a real light shimmer color over the top. And ideally, I should have done that before I put the white marks on them. Let me speed you up for a second and dry that, and I will show you what that shimmer looks like. Okay, so I dried the metallic that I put on top. So looking straight on, you get the bubbles, and you can see hopefully where I said that putting that extra little bit of a metallic coat on top kind of mutes out where some of those darker spots were, so it almost gives it a little more even gradient doing that. So looking straight on, you've got just regular bubbles, but then when you get that in the light just right, and hopefully you see the shimmer on top of there? There we go. So it's kind of a fun little element to add to your watercolor, especially if you're going to be keeping the originals or even selling the originals. It's not just a flat watercolor. You get a little bit of life and almost even like a texture with that shimmer depending on how it's in the light. So there you go, bubbles. That is the technique that I used to do the bubbles on that. So again, you just start out with a circle of light paint while it's still wet. Go back in with the darker paint right around the edges. Whether you dry it with a blow dryer or just let it sit and dry, it's still going to diffuse like this so that you get the gradient from dark to light. And then I go through and just outline them with a really fine tip black pen, add a few just regular circles for kind of like outline bubbles here and there just to give it a little more interest, and then come back with a white pen and do just a little bit of an accent on each side. That kind of gives them a little bit of a 3D look. So there you go. Mess around with the bubbles, try it with different colors. They certainly, like I said at the beginning, don't have to be all blue. Try it with different shades of blue. You can do it with pinks and greens and yellows. You can do it with every color you've got. So mess around with the bubbles, and if you have any questions on how to do that, absolutely drop me a line either through social media or my email address, and I'm happy to help you however I can. And stay tuned. We'll do more paint-alongs over time, and also please follow along at Painted Willow Art on Instagram. I am the same handle on Facebook, but I do spend most of my time on Instagram. So there you go. Happy painting, everybody.